Warriors, the class everyone either played first or considered playing first. No magic, no pets, no shapeshifting. Just armor, rage, and whatever weapon you had equipped. Warriors are the measuring stick for melee in World of Warcraft, the benchmark every other physical damage dealer gets, compared to whether that comparison is fair or not. 3 specs: Arms, Fury, and Protection. Arms is the warrior's PvP identity. A two-handed weapon, mortal strike cutting the healing on whoever you hit, and enough sustained pressure to make healers feel the clock ticking. In vanilla and early TBC, Arms warriors dominated PvP the way almost nothing else did. You would see one in Warsong Gulch and your stomach would drop. Mortal Strike was not a gimmick. It was a death sentence that forced the other team to play faster than they wanted to. The spec never fully lost that identity. Arms is still the PvP warrior spec, still built around bleeding targets out and denying healing. Fury is the berserker fantasy done right. Dual wielding, moving fast, swinging constantly. The spec is a wall of hits that never stops. Titan's Grip came in Wrath and let Fury warriors equip two-handed weapons simultaneously, which was absurd on paper and somehow even more satisfying in practice. Fury does not require finesse. It requires you to stay alive long enough to let the rotation do its work. And when you do, the damage output is some of the most fun to watch in the game. Protection is the vanilla tank spec, and still the gold standard for what a WoW tank should feel like. Prot warriors in vanilla were what raids were built around. You needed one, ideally 2, for serious progression. And that dependency gave warrior tanks a sense of responsibility that shaped how the community thought about the role for years. Shield block, devastate, revenge. The kit is mechanical, deliberate, satisfying, in the way that a set of reliable tools always is. Warriors have been part of every tier list, every meta conversation, every era of WoW for over 20 years. The class gets outclassed in stretches. There are always patches where Arms is slightly off the pace, or Protection is not the first name a raid leader writes down, but the class always comes back. It is too central to what WoW is to ever truly fall away. Warriors attract players who want to hit things as hard as possible without learning a complicated spell priority, and that audience never gets smaller. Paladins, 3 specs, 3 completely different fantasies, and for the first several years of the game, only one of them was considered worth bringing to serious content. That was the Paladin experience for a long time. Holy was needed, Protection was acceptable, and Retribution was a polite joke. In vanilla, Paladins were Alliance only. Horde had Shamans, Alliance had Paladins, and that was the deal. What Paladins were doing in those Alliance raids was buffing. Blessing of Kings on the tanks, Blessing of Might on the physical, DPS, Blessing of Wisdom on the casters. Each blessing applied individually, each lasting 2 minutes at early ranks, meaning a Paladin could spend entire trash pools cycling through the raid reapplying blessings that had fallen off. Rep Paladins, the DPS spec, were a community-wide punchline. The damage was low, the toolkit was limited, and the consensus was that if you were leveling Ret, you were enjoying the journey more than the destination. Burning Crusade changed the faction lock. Blood Elf Paladins gave Horde their first taste of the class, and TBC Holy Paladins turned out to be some of the best single-target healers in the game. You could pair a Holy Paladin on the main tank and essentially ignore that tank's health for entire fights. Beacon of Light in Wrath made it even better. Heal 1 target, and the same amount heals a second automatically. Rep Paladin got its moments at the start of Wrath. It was not a gentle moment. At launch, Ret Massos was so overtuned that a single player could walk into a PvP zone and kill multiple people in one global cooldown window. Divine Storm, Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, Exorcism, all landing in sequence created kill combos with no counterplay. Blizzard nerfed the spec within 2 weeks. Players called it the Ret Noob patch window, and the community memory of those first few weeks has never fully faded. It was the moment everyone admitted that Ret could be a real threat when tuned correctly. Protection Paladin carved out a different role from warrior tanks. Where warriors were the single-target specialists with a tight defensive rotation, Prot Paladins could grab an entire room of enemies at once. Consecration on the ground, Avenger's Shield off a target, and suddenly 10 enemies were locked onto you. That AoE tanking capability made Prot Paladins specifically valuable in Burning Crusade dungeons and in multi-target raid encounters throughout Wrath. all three specs are legitimate today. Holy, Paladin has one of the most active and demanding healing designs in the current game. Ret has finally shed its reputation and performs as a real melee threat with a complete toolkit. Protection is among the top tanks available. The class that spent years as a walking buff dispenser has become one of the most complete in WoW. Hunters. This class is why the word hunted exists in WoW vocabulary. That is not an insult to hunter players. It is a recognition that hunters were the most accessible class in the game, and accessibility attracts every kind of player, including the ones who accidentally pull the boss with volley or roll on a two-handed sword because they heard agility was good. Hunters are the ranged physical DPS class with pets, and the pet system alone has kept players in the class for 20 years. You tamed your pet from wild animals in the open world. You named it. Beast Mastery hunters bonded more deeply with their companions than any other specs, exotic pets only. BM could tame, pets with their own abilities, a whole companion system running parallel to the combat rotation. The solo content potential of BM has been best in class for most of WoW's history. A BM hunter and a well-chosen pet can handle content that would kill other DPS specs outright. Marksmanship is the sniper spec. Kill shot for finishing blows when the target drops below a health threshold. Aimed shot as the primary damage cast. Trick shots bouncing arrows through groups of enemies. In Legion, Blizzard leaned fully into the lone gunman fantasy by making the spec entirely petless. No companion, just a hunter and a rifle. Some players considered it the spec they had always wanted. Others felt the removal of the pet stripped the class of its identity. The spec since then has cycled between petless and pet optional, and the argument about which version was correct never really settled. Survival was a range spec until Legion, when Blizzard flipped it to melee, not adjusted. Fully redesigned, survival hunters now fight in close range with a polearm, using traps and bombs and serpent sting up close instead of from distance. A generation of players who had built their characters around survival's range toolkit had to make a choice. The ones who accepted the change found a spec with a genuinely interesting melee rhythm. The ones who did not still bring it up whenever class design gets discussed. Two things vanilla hunters dealt with that no longer exist. The dead zone, a range band between roughly 5 and 8 yards where ranged abilities did not work, and melee was ineffective, meaning a mob that closed distance on a hunter became genuinely dangerous. And ammo, physical arrows or bullets that took up bag space, had to be purchased or crafted and ran out at the worst possible moments. Cataclysm removed both. Nobody filed a complaint. Rogues. If you wanted someone dead in PvP before they could respond, you played a rogue. Stunlock was not a strategy. It was the entire experience, open from stealth, land cheap shot, chain into kidney shot, gouge for extra lockup, and whatever you were fighting was either dead or counting down 8 seconds with nothing to do about it. In vanilla PvP, a good rogue fighting an equally geared opponent of almost any other class was usually favoured, and that record against the field made rogues one of the most complained about specs in WoW's first several years. The class is built around 2 mechanics, stealth and combo points. Stealth gets you the opener, and the opener is where most of the burst lives. Combo points build on the target as you attack and get spent on finishers. Eviscerate for raw damage, rupture for a bleed, slice and dice for attack speed. The spec you chose shaped how you used that framework. Assassination leans on poisons, stacking damage over time on top of direct hits, and delivers steady output that does not drop off if the fight goes long. Subtlety is the layered spec. Shadow Dance, Symbols of Death, Backstab positioning. The rotation has more moving pieces than any other rogue spec, and the skill ceiling is genuinely high. Outlaw, originally called Combat, went through a pirate rework in Legion that gave it a dice-rolling randomness mechanic that some players found exciting and others found infuriating, depending on how their luck ran. Rogue has gone through more tuning cycles than most classes. The Stunlock archetype from vanilla got addressed gradually over expansions, as Blizzard tightened PvP crowd control limits across the board. The class still has one of the best PvP toolkits in the game: Blind, Kidney Shot, Cheap Shot, Vanish. But the era of a rogue soloing another player with zero interaction is mostly history. Priests. People think priests are the healer class. Shadow priests think that is funny. Shadow is one of the most distinctive specs in WoW. A caster DPS built around damage over time, vampiric touch draining life from everything it touches. devouring plague, ticking away underneath everything else, and Dispersion as a survival button that makes you immune to almost everything for 8 seconds, at the cost of doing nothing while it is active. In vanilla, Shadow Priests were barely tolerated in raids. You took one because Vampiric Embrace gave the group passive healing, and you put them somewhere out of the way. The idea of Shadow as competitive DPS took years of iteration. By Wrath it was real. By Cataclysm, and beyond it had a devoted player base that would not play anything else. Discipline is the spec that broke the rules of healing. Atonement added in Cataclysm let Disc Priests deal damage with Smite and Penance, and have a portion of that damage heal nearby allies. Healing by hurting things was a genuinely strange design, and it worked. Disc became one of the most popular healing specs in the game, not in spite of the weird mechanic, but because of it. The spec is also the bubble spec. Power. Word. Shield absorbs damage before it is taken, which means a Disc Priest's contribution does not always show up cleanly in healing meters. Healers who care about meters hate that. Raid leaders who care about not dying love it. Holy is the traditional healer. Circle of healing, prayer of healing. Renew ticking. On the whole raid, Holy Priests are the spec that does exactly what the name suggests, with a toolkit built entirely around keeping people alive in the most straightforward way available. It is never the flashy spec. It performs consistently and has never been fully out of rotation. Shamans before Burning Crusade. Shamans did not exist for half the player base. They were Horde only. The racial counterpart to the Alliance's Paladins. Each faction had an exclusive support class, and for 2 full years, Alliance players built their raids without ever having a Shaman in the group. Horde players built their entire raid meta around the Shaman toolkit, and the difference in what EE had. Each faction could do was real enough that cross-faction comparisons got complicated. 3 specs. Elemental, Enhancement, Restoration. Elemental is the ranged caster, standing at range, dropping Lightning Bolt, Lava Burst and Earth Shock into a priority rotation that has stayed recognisable across multiple expansions. Enhancement is the melee spec, one of the more visually distinct melee kits in the game. You imbue your weapons with elemental enchants, fight in close range, and the spec has a rhythm that is looser and more reactive than most melee. Dual wield enhancement with Flame Tongue. And Windfree Weapon Active is one of those specs that looks better in motion than it sounds on paper. Restoration is defined by Chain Heal, one cast bouncing between injured players, each bounce healing a little less than the last. In raid content where the group is stacked and taking consistent damage, Chain Heal was so efficient that healer compositions were built around getting the most bounces out of every cast. The spec has evolved since then, but the core identity of mobile, multi-target healing has stayed consistent. The totem system was what made Shamans feel genuinely different. You dropped totems on the ground and they radiated passive effects. Windfree totems speeding up nearby melee, Wrath of Air boosting spell haste, Tremor totem breaking fear effects on allies. Managing 4 totems at once while keeping up with your healing or DPS rotation was demanding in a way that other classes were not. Blizzard simplified totems heavily over successive expansions and eventually restructured most of them into cooldowns. It made the class easier to play. Whether that was the right call is the kind of question Shaman mains still have opinions about. Draenei brought Shamans to Alliance in Burning Crusade. The class has been shared ever since, but the Horde identity from those first 2 years is part of how long-term players think about the spec. Enhancement especially carries that history. It always felt like it was built for orcs and trolls long before the Alliance ever got access to it. Mages. Mages, glass cannons who have been in demand since vanilla, not entirely because of damage, but because every group runs better when a mage is present. The portal to Stormwind or Orgrimmar, the food and water, polymorph on the dangerous mob in the corner, time warp on the bloodlust window. Mages are one of the few classes whose utility makes them worth inviting even in patches where their DPS is not at the top of the tier list. 3 specs. Arcane, Fire, Frost. Frost is the PvP spec, and has been since the beginning of the game. Deep Freeze, Frost Nova, Blink Out of Danger, and a kit built around keeping enemies at range while pressure accumulates. Frost mages are frustrating to fight because closing the gap on one is a part-time job, and every time you think you have them, they blink away. The spec cycles in and out of PvE relevance tier to tier, but the PvP identity has never seriously shifted. Fire is the PvE benchmark in most tiers, where mages are performing well. Fireball into Pyroblast out of heating up procs, Combustion as the damage cooldown, and Ignite spreading across everything you hit. The spec is gear dependent in a way Frost is not. Fire mages at low gear levels can feel underwhelming, and the same players at high gear levels can sit at the top of the damage meter. That relationship with itemization makes Fire the spec, where being well geared feels most different from being poorly geared. When Fire is tuned and the fight gives you time to cast, it is one of the most satisfying DPS specs in the game. Arcane is the volatile one. Instead of a resource you spend, Arcane works off a stacking mechanic, where using more charges increases damage, but also burns through mana faster. Managing the ramp correctly and dumping at the right moment is the entire game. When it clicks, Arcane has some of the most satisfying burst in the game. When it does not, you are standing in a raid staring at an empty mana bar 4 seconds into the fight. Warlocks. Why do Warlock mains almost never quit the game? Other classes get switched away from constantly. Players hop between specs every new season, every tuning pass, every tier list shuffle. Warlock mains tend to stay. The class has a reputation for producing the most loyal players in WoW, people who have played the same class through 10 expansions and have no plans to change. Something about controlling demons and spreading corruption in the dark sticks with a certain kind of player in a way that other class fantasies do not. 3 specs: Affliction, Destruction, and Demonology. Affliction is the dot spec, and the core loop has been consistent since vanilla. Layer corruption, agony, unstable affliction across your target. Keep everything ticking, and drain health back into yourself while the damage stacks. The spec rewards players who can track multiple debuffs with different durations running simultaneously, and the payoff for doing it correctly is one of the most consistent damage outputs available to any caster. Affliction has historically been the spec that translates skill into numbers most directly. Better play leads to noticeably more damage, which is not always true on simpler specs. Destruction is the opposite. Chaos Bolt is the identity of the spec, a big, slow cast that hits harder than almost any single damage ability in the game when properly set up with soul shards and damage amplifiers. The whole spec builds toward making that cast land at exactly the right moment. Incinerate to build shards, hold Chaos Bolt until the execute window or the burn phase, then release. The setup is where the skill lives. Demonology is the spec where you are no longer a wizard with one demon. You are a general. Wild imps summoned on every cast, Dreadstalkers called for burst windows, Felguard as the permanent bruiser, and a demonic tyrant cooldown that extends every demon currently active. When a Demonology Warlock pops their cooldowns in a raid, the number of active pets on screen becomes genuinely chaotic. Most Demonology mains consider that a feature. Warlocks also carried utility that made them essential separate from damage entirely. Healthstones gave every player in the group a free emergency heal in their bags. Soulstones pre-resurrected a player before they died, letting the group recover without losing a full wipe reset. Summoning portals pulled absent raid members directly to the instance. For a generation of WoW players, the Warlock in the raid was also the logistics officer, and the class was welcomed partly for the DPS, and partly because the group just ran better with one present. Druids. Every other class picks one job and sticks with it. Druids ignored that entirely. Not partially, entirely. The Druid is the only class in WoW that can fill every role in the game at a competitive level, and the community reaction to that has always been somewhere between appreciation and low-grade frustration, because a class that can do everything is also a class you can pressure into doing anything. 4 specs: Balance, Feral, Guardian, Restoration. Balance is the ranged caster, better known as Boomkin, because the Moonkin form looks like a large feathered bird that stumbled into a fight and decided it was committed. Balance spent years as a meme spec in vanilla, technically playable, but not competitive in most raid settings, and players who mained it were either deeply attached to the fantasy or genuinely unaware of tier lists. That changed. Over time, Balance became a real contributor across multiple expansion tiers, the Star Surge and Starfall toolkit finding relevance in high movement fights that punished turret specs. A good Balance Druid in a current raid, is doing real work, which is a different statement than anything you could have made about the spec in 2004. Feral is the melee DPS spec in cat form, and in classic WoW, it was one of the most demanding rotations in the game. Maintaining Rake, Rip, Shred, Savage Roar, and Ferocious Bite while managing energy regeneration and combo points required an attention to priority and timing that most melee specs did not demand. Players who learned Feral correctly were competitive. Players who did not were noticeably behind. The high floor kept many players away, which meant actual Feral mains developed a certain pride of ownership. They were playing something most people had written off, and doing it well. Guardian is the bear tank, and in Wrath, it was nearly unkillable in specific scenarios. The mitigation model for Guardian, absorbing incoming hits and recovering through the Deathstrike adjacent frenzied regeneration loop, made bear tanks specifically valuable on hard-hitting single-target bosses where consistent mitigation mattered more than big reactive cooldowns. Players who tanked as bears in Ulduar and ICC remember a spec that felt physically durable in a way that matched the visual. Restoration Druid is the hybrid healer, defined by HOTS, rejuvenation, regrowth, life bloom, stacking across multiple targets and ticking constantly. The spec rarely topped raw healing output in any given tier. What it offered instead was flexibility, instant casts while moving, blanket coverage on a whole raid, swift mend for burst healing when something went wrong, wild growth for AoE recovery. Resto Druids had an answer for nearly every scenario healers faced, and smart raid leaders valued that toolkit, even when the meters did not fully reflect it. The Druid's versatility is what makes the class unique, and what creates its most common frustration. Guilds recruit Druids knowing they can cover any gap, and that knowledge becomes pressure. The Druid who mains balance gets asked to tank when the regular tank does not show. The Feral gets asked to heal. The class attracts players who genuinely enjoy flexibility and becomes a trap for the ones who wanted to specialise but keep getting drafted elsewhere. Death Knights. When Wrath of the Lich King launched on November 13th, 2008, every server was flooded with Death Knights within hours. The class started at level 55 in a dedicated starting zone in Northrend, and everyone who bought the expansion made one immediately, including players who had no intention of ever maining the class. The starting zone was just that good. The Ebonhold questline put you in the role of a servant of the Lich King, carrying out his orders in the plagued countryside of Havenshire. You did dark things. Pointed, deliberate quest objectives that felt different from anything WoW had asked players to do before. Then the questline pivoted and you broke free, joining the mortal forces against your former master. It was the most cinematic class introduction Blizzard had built at that point, and it worked on players who had not paid attention to WoW lore in years. The DK starting zone is still held up as one of the best designed zones in the game's history, and it was responsible for getting a lot of people more invested in the story than they expected to be. 3 specs: Blood, Frost, and Unholy. In Wrath, all 3 could function as either DPS or tank, which was a balancing nightmare. Cataclysm resolved it by locking Blood into tanking and shifting Frost and Unholy to pure DPS, giving each spec a cleaner identity. The class runs on runes, a resource system unique to Death Knights, where abilities cost specific combinations of rune types that replenish on a timer. Managing the rune economy is the mechanical puzzle underneath every DK rotation, and it is more demanding than the class's visual, imposing factor suggests. Blood is the self-sustaining tank. Deathstrike heals you for a percentage of damage taken in the recent window, which means the more pressure you take, the bigger your heals get. It is a spec that gets stronger under fire. A Blood DK tanking a hard-hitting boss is a feedback loop of absorbing damage and recovering from it. The playstyle rewards players comfortable, sitting at lower health percentages and trusting the regeneration. Frost is built around Obliterate, a massive melee strike that hits hard enough to feel satisfying every single time it connects. Apply diseases, hit Obliterate when the runes are up, use Frost Strike to dump runic power. The rotation is more straightforward than Unholy, and in tiers where Frost is tuned well, it is one of the better performing melee specs in the game. Unholy is the disease and undead spec. You have a permanent ghoul companion, spread festering wounds, and pop them with Scourge Strike for burst windows. The fantasy is unambiguous. Every ability name reads like something out of a horror novel, and the visual of your character, surrounded by a ghoul, and a cloud of diseases matches the tone exactly. Unholy mains are a specific type of person who picked the class because it matched an aesthetic they wanted, and they are almost always correct about that being worth it. Monks. The problem with being added in Mists of Pandaria was that you arrived packaged with the most controversial expansion theme in WoW history, and a significant portion of the player base made up their mind about you before logging in. Pandas and monks came together, and for players who bounced off Mists early, the class got written off alongside the expansion's setting. That was a mistake. Monk is one of the better designed classes in WoW. 3 specs: Windwalker, Mistweaver, and Brewmaster. Windwalker is the melee DPS spec. Fast, mobile, combo-based, using chi as the primary resource. The rotation is fluid in a way that feels different from most melee, closer to a fighting game rhythm than the deliberate swing and weight of Warrior or Death Knight. Windwalker has high mobility and one of the more active DPS kits in the game, which means it rewards players who stay engaged and punishes the ones who go on autopilot. Mistweaver is the healing spec, and it introduced fist weaving, the option to heal primarily by dealing melee damage, with atonement-style returns converting some of that output into group health. Most Mistweaver players stick to traditional casting and serious content, but the option to heal through punching people is genuinely distinct, and it says something about the spec's ambition that the mechanic exists at all. Brewmaster is the most mechanically interesting tank in the game. Stagger absorbs a portion of incoming damage and spreads it out as a damage overtime effect, which you then purify by pressing a button. You are constantly monitoring the stagger pool, deciding when to purify and when to let it tick down naturally. The active management required makes Brewmaster a more engaging tanking experience than most other specs. You are never just pressing cooldowns and hoping, you are making real decisions about health management on every pull. Monks never got the cultural foothold of older classes. They are respected, they perform, they have devoted mains. But the association with Mists of Pandaria lingered far longer than it should have, and the class still occasionally gets underestimated by players who formed their opinion in 2012 and never revisited it. Demon Hunters. Demon Hunters, also known as the class everyone rolls when they want to feel like the main character, arrived in Legion as the second hero class and immediately became one of the most visible presences in the game. The starting experience framed you as someone who had sacrificed everything to fight demons by becoming partially demonic, and the visual design committed fully to that concept. Fell eyes, tattoos, horns, the whole package. The community noticed the pattern of who was drawn to that aesthetic almost immediately. 2 specs, the only class in the game with just 2. Havoc is the DPS spec, and it is one of the most mobile melee specs ever designed. Double jump, fell rush, vengeful retreat. Demon Hunters can traverse combat zones in ways that make every other melee feel slow. The spec is built around burst windows and staying in constant motion, which makes it intuitive for players who like high-action gameplay and frustrating for raid encounters that require standing in one spot. Vengeance is the tank spec, and where Havoc is about speed, Vengeance is about self-sustain. Demon spikes, Metamorphosis as a defensive. The ability to heal off damage dealt through frailty. Vengeance Demon Hunters are hard to kill because the spec is designed to regenerate under pressure. It is a different survivability model from Blood DK's absorb and heal loop or Warrior's cooldown rotation, leaning more toward constant passive mitigation than big active responses. The edgy player stereotype has followed the class since launch and has not fully gone away. That said, the actual design of both specs is good. Blizzard built a focused, well-tuned class with 2 distinct identities, and the lack of a third spec arguably meant both halves got more development attention than they would have with resources split further. Demon Hunters are also elf-only. Night Elf for Alliance, Blood Elf for Horde, which gives the class a visual consistency across all players that makes them instantly recognisable anywhere in the game. Evokers. 1 race, 1 class, 3 specs, and a design philosophy WoW had not attempted before. Evokers are the Dragonflight hero class, tied exclusively to the Drakthir, a dragon humanoid race that can only be Evokers. You cannot play a Drakthir as anything else, and you cannot play an Evoker as any other race. That lock-in is unique in WoW, and the debate about whether it was the right call is still running. 3 specs: Devastation, Preservation, and Augmentation. Devastation is the DPS spec with mid-range fire, an arcane caster with empowered casts as the central mechanic. You hold certain abilities down and charge them to higher tiers of power, releasing for a bigger effect. The mechanic of holding a button, rather than pressing it, is different enough from every other caster in the game that it genuinely changes how the spec feels to play. Devastation also has a mid-range design, which means it is not fully melee and not fully at max range. It occupies a space between the two that creates its own set of positioning considerations. Preservation is the healing spec, built around the Bronze Dragonflight's time manipulation theme. The kit includes abilities that send healing forward and backward through time, Echo, which places a charge on an ally that activates later, and Rewind, which can effectively undo a few seconds of damage taken by the raid. The design is more conceptually distinct than most healer kits, and players who think seriously about healing mechanics tend to find preservation worth learning. Augmentation is the interesting one. It launched in Dragonflight's second major patch as the first support DPS spec in WoW's history, a spec whose entire purpose is making the 3 other DPS players in the group hit harder. Augmentation Evokers do not show up prominently on standard damage meters because a significant portion of their contribution appears in everyone else's numbers. This created an immediate problem. How do you evaluate a spec whose output is invisible? Logs did not capture it cleanly, raid leaders did not always understand it, and players who wanted to be ranked on their contribution felt shortchanged by a system that could not see what they were doing. Blizzard eventually added tools to better track augmentation's effect on group output, but the debate over how to value a support spec in a damage meter culture has not been fully resolved. Evokers still feel new, the kit is distinct, the specs are all doing something genuinely different, and the Drakthir visual, full dragon form in combat, humanoid form in cities, is one of the more memorable additions to the game's roster of playable options in recent years. Whether locking the class to one race forever was worth the trade-offs is a different question, and one Blizzard will probably keep answering with how the class develops over the next few expansions.